we are really cracking on with this argument for the conclusion that if you have premises about moral scenarios and those premises are not justified by inference, then you probably shouldn't be relying on them if your aim is to establish knowledge. So interesting conclusion. Where are we in the argument? Good question, Steve. We're right here. Last key premise. The claim is that we have reason to suspect that moral scenarios which philosophers consider are unfamiliar situations. Now right here I want to take a roundabout route. So what I'm going to do is first of all consider how Green presents this, and I think he's wrong. So although I'm trying to reconstruct an argument from Green, at least loosely, I think he's not giving us a good case for this premise. I'm then going to go my own way and offer you two reasons to suspect that the moral scenarios philosophers consider are unfamiliar situations. Do I think we can be sure that they are? No, I don't. I think we've got good reason to suspect that they are. All right, but first of all, let's take a look at Green. So Green's interest partly is in trying to distinguish between different dilemmas. So I want you to consider one last time. No, actually not one last time. We're going to keep doing this. But here it is once again. Here's a dilemma, and I'm going to compare this with another one, as always. So this is the standard runaway trolley one with the video from The Good Place. Chidi's got to steer the tram. I do love that. Chidi turns out to be such a hero. There you go. But sorry, don't spoil it for me. I haven't finished watching The Good Place yet. It's a TV series about ethics and other things. Very silly, but lots of fun. Anyway, what you're supposed to do is compare trolley to a variety of other dilemmas, and this one is called footbridge. So Mary notices an empty boxcar rolling out of control. Anybody hits is going to die. Mary does nothing, boxcar's going to hit 5 people. Mary can, though, pull a lever, and that's going to release the bottom of a footbridge. One person's going to fall out into the path of the trolley, the boxcar, stop it and save the lives of 5 people. And that's the only thing that she can do. Otherwise, the 5 people will certainly die. Is it okay for her to pull the lever? Sorry, it says, is it for her to pull the lever there? Which is a different question. Not a bad question either. She's the only person who could do that. So if someone's going to do that, it's for her. The question is it okay for her to pull the lever? Now, interestingly, people have different judgments about these cases. So for the most part, people tend to say yes here, and they tend to say no there. But as we discussed earlier in the course, there are also some interesting order of presentation effects and some good questions why they're true. Now, what Green wants to do, in part, is to say that footbridge is an unfamiliar scenario, but not make the same claim about trolley, and use that to say, kind of, as it were, this is the right answer. The fact that this is an unfamiliar scenario means that we shouldn't trust the responses given to the scenario to the same extent that we trust the responses given to the trolley scenario. That would be beautiful if it worked. That would be fantastic, because it would give us an incredibly strong conclusion, a good direction about where to go. But look what Green says. I strongly suspect that. Oh, hang on a second, right? If you were writing this essay, you get a little comment from me, which would be, it's not about you. It's not about you. Now, Green is telling us, I strongly suspect. I can't argue with that, right? Only Green can tell me what he strongly suspects. There's nothing really to discuss. But interestingly, of course, what Green wants to do is go from the fact that he strongly suspects this, but then rely on the truth. And that's a terrible idea, isn't it? Right? You strongly suspect this, I strongly suspect that. So what? So what? Always ask yourself, so what? It's not about you. It's not about Green. It's not about me. None of us are interesting here. What we're after is the truth. So let's get rid of that. Sorry. Bad reaction, Steve. You're bored of this mess. I know, I'm sorry. Okay, I shouldn't keep going on about this. Stop. Right, here's the claim. The footbridge dilemma is unfamiliar, a bizarre case in which an act of personal violence against an innocent person is the one and only way to promote a much greater good. And that's it. That's it. Now, I agree that the footbridge dilemma is bizarre and highly implausible. But recall earlier the discussion about unfamiliar situations and Green's no cognitive miracles principle. In that context, we saw that unfamiliar problems are ones with which we have inadequate evolutionary, cultural or personal experience, where inadequate is characterized relative to the ability of the fast processes to make use of that experience. So it's pretty tricky, I think, to establish on this basis that something is unfamiliar. It's helpful to do a comparison with an example that we considered earlier, chess. This is relevant because, as I was saying there, it's thought that expert chess players, at least in some situations, are relying on fast processes. For example, in speed chess, that's quite plausible. So Green might have said, he didn't say this, but he might have said, look, the chess match is unfamiliar. A bizarre case in which moving some oddly shaped wooden figures around 64 squares in accordance with some arcane rules is the only way to win fame and fortune, for most chess players anyway. Right. Now, I take it that this is roughly as convincing as the claim that Green made about the footbridge dilemma. We should accept the claim about the footbridge dilemma just if we're prepared to accept the claim about the chess match. But of course the chess match can't be unfamiliar in our relative technical sense unless it's not true that fast processes can underpin expert performance in chess. So what I think is that we don't know that what Green is saying is true here. I haven't argued that the substance of Green's claim is known to be false, that the footbridge dilemma is somehow not an unfamiliar situation. I don't know that. I just think that this mode of argument cannot lead us to knowledge about whether or not a situation is familiar or not. Given how we're thinking about familiarity, we can't use this kind of argument to establish that something is familiar or not. So, in that case, what am I saying? Am I saying that we should reject the premise labelled 5 in our argument here? No, I'm not. I think we should find alternative grounds to accept it. What reasons might we have to suspect that moral scenarios typically considered by philosophers are unfamiliar situations in our special technical sense? Well, let's go back to Hogarth's idea about wicked learning environments. So some environments are great because the learning environments just correspond almost exactly to the situation that you later find yourself in, but other environments are wicked to some degree. They involve a disconnect between situations in which you do your learning, your processes are shaped, fast processes, and later events. And as you recall, Hogarth said, look, we should impose a fairly stringent criteria for relying on experts' judgments when those judgments are based on fast processes. We should require that they have experience representative of the situation and that their experience is supported by much valid feedback. Then we can trust the intuition, the judgment that seems right to them, even though they can't necessarily justify it. Otherwise, we should, as Hogarth says, be careful. Now go back again to the footbridge case. Is it plausible that these criteria are met? Is it plausible that we have much experience which is representative of this kind of scenario? Hard to say. Is it plausible that in making ethical judgments we have a lot of valid feedback? Do we have much valid feedback that would help us to make judgments in these kind of cases? So these are the questions that we need to ask in order to decide whether or not it's a familiar situation for practical purposes, in order to apply the no cognitive miracles principle. Well, I think it's a safe assumption that no one knows the answer to this question as things stand. No one knows the answer to this question as things stand. Now there you might say, well, Steve, what's the point? I'll tell you what the point is. Let's also make things worse for ourselves. So let's try to make it as hard as possible for the loose reconstruction of Green's argument to work. So there we're going to assume that experience and feedback that we have are quite rich and varied, and that the fast processes are able to deal with this feedback and respond flexibly to it. So that's going to make things hard for our argument to succeed. But what you've got to note here is that even on the boldest and most optimistic view, there are going to be some moral scenarios that are bizarre enough that the answers to both of these questions, could past experience be representative of a moral scenario, and is the experience supported by much valid feedback, the answer to those questions are going to turn out to be no. right? Even on the most extreme view. So Railton, I think, has a relatively optimistic view about fast processes, but I think he would surely allow that there are moral scenarios so bizarre that we'd have to say past experience isn't representative of them, or we don't have sufficient valid feedback, or presumably both. All right, that's fine. So we can't answer these questions specifically about footbridge, but we can say, well, there are some scenarios. And then here's the last thing. Philosophers are using moral scenarios largely to explore edge cases and very fine contrasts, pairs that are very finely balanced. But doing that, of course, increases the risk of outrunning the representative experience and valid feedback. It's almost as if the philosophers, their method is designed precisely in order to locate unfamiliar problems, unfamiliar situations in these moral scenarios that they consider. And that may be a good thing, because it may actually be quite fruitful, at least it seems that way in the history of physics. It may be quite fruitful to consider unfamiliar situations and think about what seems right in those situations, and then try to explore whether there are other ways of coming at knowledge that undermine the impression. Right? The impression remains, but other ways of coming at this tell us it must just be false. Drop a large and a small lead ball from the top of a tower at the same time, and they will land at the bottom roughly simultaneously, quite differently from how Aristotle thought it would be. There you go. So here's a reason to suspect, even if footbridge itself, we don't know whether or not footbridge is a unfamiliar situation, that the kinds of things philosophers are doing will lead them often enough to be considering unfamiliar situations, even on relatively optimistic views about the experience and feedback available. So that's one reason to think that we should suspect philosophers of using unfamiliar situations. A second independent reason arises if we ask the question, can we expect to find limits? Can we expect to find limits? Now, if you look at Railton, I'm not suggesting you do this actually, this is an incredibly long paper, it's very, very interesting, but there's all kinds of detail in there and you don't need that for this course. All you need to know is this, Railton is very much stressing that fast processes are pretty flexible, they're all to do with training, they're much more sort of manipulable than anybody had thought previously. And you kind of see that if you think about the expert chess players, right? So Railton clearly has a point here. The striking thing about Railton, though, is he makes no mention, at least not that I can find, of limits. Now, it could be that, I fell asleep partway through this inordinately long paper, or I haven't read all of them, and there is a mention of limits somewhere in the various things he's written on this. Very brilliant philosopher, highly recommended, except for I'm not recommending that you read it for this course because it would be too much. But it would be great to read in general. Anyway, he makes no mention of limits. I think this is a mistake because we know that in other domains, fast processes show signature limits, even in adults and even in experts. So this is true in objects. I actually showed you this in the preview where we compared the physics and the ethics case. We saw that even people with lots of training in physics who knew the facts were nevertheless susceptible to an impression created by the way that the fast processes work. It's been established, I think, in the case of cognition concerning other minds, so what's sometimes called mind reading, and it's also been established in the case of number cognition. In fact, there's a whole range, a whole family of signature limits, so that if you relied on fast processes to underpin judgments about number, you would end up with quite a strange form, quite a limited form of mathematics. But the important thing here is not just that we have found signature limits in other domains, it's that there's a good theoretical reason to expect that we should find signature limits. So more than a century of research in cognitive science has repeatedly found that any broadly inferential process has to make a trade-off between speed and accuracy. In order to gain speed, you typically have to sacrifice accuracy, and conversely. That kind of makes sense if you think about it. Now, that's not to say that, sometimes, that's not to deny that sometimes you're more accurate when you're faster than when you're slower. That's absolutely right. Sometimes taking your time actually makes you worse than responding very quickly. That's true. That's not how to understand the speed-accuracy trade-off, though. The speed-accuracy trade-off says there's kind of a hard bottom line, right? So if you make something as fast as it can reasonably be made, in order to go any faster, you're now going to have to drop some of the accuracy. And plausibly, in some central cases, what's happening there is just that you're considering less information. That's how you're gaining speed. So your decisions are less accurate because you're considering a narrower range of information, but you're able to make them faster. And that may be essential, of course, because you may be no use to you to have a late decision. A fast and inaccurate decision may be better than a slower and more accurate decision. All right, so what's the suggestion here? The suggestion is very simple. There are these speed-accuracy trade-offs. There seems to be a kind of a law in governing any broadly inferential process. You want to go faster, all right, you're going to have to give up some of the accuracy. That means, of course, that when you look at fast processes, you expect to find that they are limited in ways that are not predicted by the environment that they operate in, so they make incorrect predictions, and they're limited relative to the slower processes, which are making a different trade-off. That's why you have fast and slow processes, so that you can achieve different speed accuracy trade-offs within a single organism. Marvellous, well done. But that tells us that there ought to be limits. There ought to be limits in the fast processes, and that tells us that very often we're going to be in unfamiliar situations when we're considering moral scenarios. Not all the time, but often enough if we're trying to consider sets of moral scenarios. So here's why I think that the premise labelled 5 is a true premise. Firstly, even on a view on which the fast processes have super much experience, lots of valid feedback, even in the most generous view there are going to be moral scenarios which are bizarre enough to be unfamiliar situations, and the methods that philosophers use, their interest in edge cases and fine distinctions, means that they are susceptible to hitting just on those unfamiliar situations. That's a reason to suspect that their moral scenarios may be unfamiliar situations. Do we know which are unfamiliar and which are familiar? No, we don't, because we don't understand how the fast processes work. We don't understand the principles yet, I think. Nobody does. The second reason is this. We know that fast processes involve trading accuracy in order to gain speed. We know that in other domains that leaves us with fairly interesting, substantial signature limits, respects in which these are limited. And that means that even experts with considerable training may, in considering quite ordinary seeming situations, run unwittingly into unfamiliar problems. And it's not unreasonable to suspect that that's the case in philosophy as well. I'm not saying we know that it is the case, I'm saying it's a reasonable suspicion that some of these cases are interesting precisely because they involve these signature limits. That's why I think premise 5 is true. Oh, exciting. Do you know what's just happened? We've actually got all the way through the argument. We've just got to bring it together in a tiny conclusion.